The bright lights of Metropolitan General Hospital's emergency room never dimmed, even at 2 a.m. on a cold Tuesday morning. Dr. Marcus Thompson stood at the nurse's station, his dark blue scrubs neat despite being 8 hours into his 12-hour shift. At 42 years old, he had spent the last 15 years building his reputation as one of Atlanta's finest emergency medicine doctors. "Dr. Thompson, we need you in room 4. Sarah, one of the night nurses, called out as she rushed past with an armful of supplies. He quickly grabbed his stethoscope and followed her, his sturdy shoes making soft squeaking sounds on the polished floor. The emergency room was having its usual busy night. 3 nurses were helping elderly patients, 2 doctors were stitching up minor injuries, and the waiting room was half full with people holding ice packs and tired expressions. But Dr. Thompson had learned long ago how to stay calm in the middle of chaos. As chief of emergency medicine, he could have taken the easier shifts during the day. But Marcus believed in leading by example, which meant taking his fair share of night shifts when the hospital was often short-staffed and the cases were usually more serious. "BP is dropping, doctor," Sarah reported as they worked on a young woman who had come in with severe stomach pain. Dr. Thompson's skilled hands moved quickly as he examined the patient, his mind already working through possible diagnosis. Just then, the emergency room doors burst open. 2 paramedics rushed in pushing a stretcher, their faces showing the urgency of the situation. "Officer down. Vehicle collision. Multiple injuries." One of them shouted. Dr. Thompson's head snapped up. "Sarah, Dr. Parker can take over, dear. This is stable now." He moved swiftly toward the incoming trauma case, his experienced eyes already assessing the situation. The injured man on the stretcher wore a torn police uniform. His face was badly bruised, and blood had soaked through his shirt. The name tag on his chest read, "Hesked Barrett." The officer's skin was pale, and his breathing was shallow, signs that worried Dr. Thompson immediately. "What happened?" he asked the paramedics as they transferred the officer to a trauma bay bed. The machines around them started beeping as nurses connected monitoring equipment. "High-speed chase ended in a crash," one paramedic explained quickly. "Officer Barrett here was pursuing a suspect when his car hit a concrete barrier. Found him unconscious at the scene. BP's been dropping since we got him out." Dr. Thompson worked methodically, checking the officer's pupils, listening to his chest, and examining the extent of his injuries. His hands moved with practiced precision as he called out orders to his team. "Get me a trauma panel, full-body CT, and type and cross for 4 units. Call surgery and tell them we need them now." The officer's blood pressure kept dropping despite their initial treatments. Dr. Thompson could see the internal bleeding was severe. They couldn't wait for the surgical team. Time was running out. "We're losing him," a nurse called out as the monitors started alarming. The officer's heart rate was becoming erratic. In that moment, Dr. Thompson made a decision that would change both their lives, though he didn't know it yet. "We're doing this here. Now, get me a trauma kit and call respiratory. We need to open him up." The team moved like a well-oiled machine, knowing Dr. Thompson's reputation for making the right calls under pressure. They quickly prepared for an emergency procedure right there in the trauma bay, something usually done only as a last resort. As Dr. Thompson made the first incision, he pushed away all thoughts except saving the life in front of him. He didn't see a white officer or a police uniform anymore. He saw a human being who needed his help. His steady hands worked skillfully as he fought against time to stop the internal bleeding. Little did he know that in 3 months, this same officer would have him standing against his car in handcuffs, their roles reversed in a way neither could have imagined. But for now, in the bright lights of the emergency room, Dr. Marcus Thompson was doing what he did best, saving lives without asking questions about who deserved his care. The emergency room became completely silent except for the steady beeping of machines and Dr. Thompson's clear, firm voice giving instructions. Every person in the trauma bay knew they were watching something rare, an emergency thoracotomy, a procedure usually done only in operating rooms, not in the ER. "More suction here," Dr. Thompson said calmly, his forehead showing small beads of sweat under the bright lights. His dark hands moved with incredible speed and precision inside Officer Barrett's chest cavity. The bleeding was worse than he had first thought. Sarah, his trusted nurse, stood ready with instruments before he even asked for them. She had worked with Dr. Thompson long enough to predict his needs. Blood pressure still dropping, doctor, she reported, her eyes fixed on the monitors. Two more nurses rushed in with fresh units of blood. The floor around them was covered in used gauze and empty packages, showing how long they had been fighting to save the officer's life. It had been 45 minutes since they started the emergency surgery. There's the bleeder, Dr. Thompson muttered, finally finding the torn blood vessel that was causing all the trouble. His fingers, though tired, didn't shake at all as he worked to repair it. Give me the 3-0 silk suture. Just then, more people burst into the trauma bay. Dr. Williams, the chief surgeon, had finally arrived with his team. They stopped short when they saw what was happening. Instead of taking over, Dr. Williams stepped back, recognizing that moving the patient now would be more dangerous than letting Dr. Thompson finish. What do you need? Dr. Williams asked, respecting his colleague's work. Almost done here, Dr. Thompson replied without looking up. But we'll need an oar ready for the secondary repairs once he's stable. The minutes ticked by slowly. Everyone in the room held their breath as Dr. Thompson carefully placed the last sutures. Finally, after what seemed like hours but was really just 20 more minutes, the monitors showed improvement. Blood pressure rising, Sarah announced, relief clear in her voice. Heart rate stabilizing. Dr. Thompson straightened his back, rolling his shoulders to release the tension. He had been bent over the patient for over an hour, not moving, barely breathing himself as he concentrated on saving this man's life. He's stable enough to move, he announced. Get him to OR 2. Dr. Williams, there's still work to be done, but the immediate danger is past. As the surgical team prepared to move Officer Barrett, Dr. Thompson stepped back and pulled off his bloody gloves. He looked at the officer's face, peaceful now under the breathing tube. The man had no idea that his life had just hung by a thread, or that a black doctor he had never met had just spent 2 hours fighting death away from his door. Outside the trauma bay, other doctors and nurses stepped aside respectfully as Dr. Thompson walked to the sink to scrub his hands. They had all heard about what happened. News traveled fast in hospitals, especially news about extraordinary saves. That was incredible, Dr. Thompson, a young resident said, her eyes wide with admiration. Dr. Thompson just nodded, too tired to say much. He watched as Officer Barrett was wheeled past him toward the operating room for the remaining repairs. The officer's uniform had been cut away, and now he was just another patient, another life that needed saving. Two police officers who had arrived during the surgery stood nearby, looking worried about their colleague. One of them approached Dr. Thompson. Doc, is he going to make it? The officer asked, his face showing concern for his partner. Yes, Dr. Thompson replied simply. The worst is over. Dr. Williams will finish the repairs, but your colleague should recover fully with time and proper care. The officers thanked him and hurried off to call their department with the update. Dr. Thompson watched them go, then looked down at his scrubs, now covered in Officer Barrett's blood. In his 15 years as a doctor, he had learned that blood was always the same color, no matter whose body it came from. He had no way of knowing that this night would come back to haunt both him and Officer Barrett in ways neither of them could imagine. For now, though, he had other patients waiting, other lives that needed his attention. Dr. Thompson headed to the locker room to change his scrubs, ready to face whatever else the night might bring. 2 weeks passed slowly in the ICU of Metropolitan General Hospital. Officer James Barrett lay in room 412, surrounded by the constant beeping of monitors and the gentle hum of medical equipment. His room was never empty. When fellow officers weren't visiting, his family members took turns sitting beside his bed. Dr. Marcus Thompson made his usual morning rounds, stopping outside room 412. Through the glass window, he could see Officer Barrett was finally awake, talking with his wife. The breathing tube had been removed 3 days ago, and color had returned to the officer's face. It was a dramatic improvement from the pale, broken man they had brought in that night. Good morning, Dr. Thompson. Linda, the ICU nurse, greeted him as she updated the patient charts. Officer Barrett's latest vitals are all normal. His wife says he managed to eat some solid food this morning. Dr. Thompson nodded, looking down at the medical chart on his tablet. He had been checking on Barrett's progress every day, but always timed his visits when the officer was either asleep or had visitors. Something inside him preferred to remain anonymous. Just another doctor in a hospital full of medical staff. The surgery site is healing well, Linda continued. No signs of infection. Dr. Williams thinks he might be ready to move to regular rooms by the end of the week. Inside room 412, Officer Barrett's wife noticed Dr. Thompson standing outside. She smiled and waved, though she didn't know he was the doctor who had performed the emergency surgery that saved her husband's life. To her, he was just another one of the many doctors who checked on patients. Dr. Thompson gave a polite nod and moved on to his next patient. He had learned long ago that sometimes it was better to stay in the background. His job was to save lives, not to be recognized for it. Later that afternoon, Dr. Thompson was reviewing patient files when he overheard two officers talking near the nurse's station. They were visiting Barrett and discussing the accident. "Man, Jimmy's lucky to be alive," one officer said. "The paramedics said they thought we'd lost him for sure." "Yeah, heard some doctor opened him up right there in the ER," the other replied. "Must have been one hell of a surgeon. Jimmy doesn't even remember anything from that night." Dr. Thompson kept his eyes on his work, pretending not to hear their conversation. He remembered every detail of that night: the torn blood vessel, the dropping blood pressure, the tense minutes as they fought to save Barrett's life. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was that Officer Barrett was recovering. As days passed, more police officers came and went from room 412. They brought flowers, cards, and stories to keep their colleagues' spirits up. Dr. Thompson watched from a distance as Barrett grew stronger, starting his physical therapy and taking short walks around the ICU floor. One morning, Dr. Thompson arrived early to find Officer Barrett sitting up in a chair by his window, looking out at the Atlanta skyline. The officer's police uniform hung in the closet, cleaned and pressed, waiting for his return to duty. "Your recovery is quite remarkable," Dr. Thompson said professionally, making his first direct contact with his patient. "How are you feeling today?" "Better every day, Doc," Barrett replied, not knowing he was speaking to the man who had saved his life. "Can't wait to get back to work." Dr. Thompson made some notes in the chart and checked Barrett's vital signs. Everything looked good. "Well, keep following your physical therapy routine, and that shouldn't be too far off." As he left the room, Dr. Thompson thought about how strange life could be. Here was a man whose heart he had literally held in his hands, yet they were strangers to each other. He had no way of knowing that their next meeting would be under very different circumstances, not in the safe, controlled environment of the hospital, but on a dark street where assumptions and prejudices would create a very different kind of emergency. That evening, Dr. Thompson signed the papers approving Officer Barrett's transfer to regular rooms. In 3 days, Barrett would be discharged, and their paths would separate, until that fateful night 3 months later when everything would change for both of them. The clock showed 11:45 p.m. as Dr. Marcus Thompson finally left Metropolitan General Hospital. It had been another long day filled with emergencies, worried families, and the endless paperwork that came with being chief of emergency medicine. His dark blue BMW pulled out of the hospital parking lot, heading toward his home in the quiet suburbs of Atlanta. The streets were nearly empty at this hour. Street lights cast long shadows across the road as Dr. Thompson drove, his mind already thinking about the few hours of sleep he might get before his next shift. His white doctor's coat hung in the back seat, and his hospital ID badge dangled from the rearview mirror. He didn't notice the police car following him at first. The blue and white vehicle had pulled out from a side street and stayed a few car lengths behind. Dr. Thompson was too tired to pay attention to his rearview mirror, focusing instead on the road ahead and thoughts of his comfortable bed. Suddenly, red and blue lights flashed behind him, cutting through the darkness. Dr. Thompson checked his speedometer. He hadn't been speeding. Confused but calm, he signaled and pulled over to the right side of the road, just as he had been taught to do. The police car stopped behind him, its bright lights making it impossible for Dr. Thompson to see the officer in his mirrors. He did everything by the book. Turned off his engine, placed his hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, and waited patiently. Heavy footsteps approached his car. A flashlight beam swept across his face, then around the inside of his vehicle. Dr. Thompson squinted against the bright light but kept his hands visible on the wheel. "License and registration," a firm voice commanded. Dr. Thompson's heart skipped a beat. He recognized that voice, though he couldn't place it immediately. "Of course, officer," Dr. Thompson replied calmly. "My license is in my wallet, and the registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for them now, if that's okay." Slowly, the officer warned, his hand resting on his holster. As Dr. Thompson carefully reached for his wallet, the flashlight beam caught his hospital ID badge hanging from the mirror. The officer's attention shifted to it. "That hospital ID, let me see it," the officer demanded. Dr. Thompson unclipped the badge and handed it out the window. In the dim light, he finally got a good look at the officer's face. It was Sergeant James Barrett, the same man whose life he had saved 3 months ago. But Barrett didn't recognize him. "Chief of Emergency Medicine?" Barrett's voice was skeptical. "This can't be right." "It is right, Officer Barrett," Dr. Thompson said quietly. "I'm the Chief of Emergency Medicine at Metropolitan General. I just finished my shift." Barrett's posture stiffened at the use of his name. "How do you know my name?" "I was one of your doctors when you were in the hospital after your accident," Dr. Thompson explained patiently. "You can call the hospital to verify my identity." But something had changed in Barrett's demeanor. The mention of the hospital seemed to make him more suspicious, not less. He shone the flashlight directly in Dr. Thompson's face again, his expression hardening. "Step out of the vehicle," Barrett ordered, his voice now cold and official. "Officer, is there a problem?" Dr. Thompson asked, still keeping his voice steady despite the growing knot in his stomach. "I said step out of the vehicle," Barrett repeated more forcefully. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Dr. Thompson's mind raced as he carefully opened his car door. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. Just 3 months ago, he had fought to save this man's life, and now that same man was treating him like a criminal. The night air was cool as Dr. Thompson stood beside his car, hands raised slightly at his sides. Other cars occasionally passed by, their headlights briefly illuminating the scene. A black doctor in surgical scrubs being confronted by a white police officer who had no idea that he owed his life to the man he now suspected. Barrett reached for his radio, his eyes never leaving Dr. Thompson. "Dispatch, I'm going to need backup at my location," he said into his shoulder mic. "Possible fraudulent identification, suspicious vehicle." Dr. Thompson closed his eyes briefly, knowing this long night was about to get much longer. The sound of distant sirens told him that their confrontation was only beginning. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder as Dr. Marcus Thompson stood beside his BMW, the cool night air making his surgical scrubs feel thin. Officer Barrett kept his flashlight trained on him, creating a bright circle of light that made Thompson feel like he was on stage in some terrible play. "Put your hands behind your back," Barrett ordered, pulling out his handcuffs. The metal clicked coldly around Dr. Thompson's wrists, the same wrists that had held surgical instruments to save Barrett's life just 3 months ago. "Officer Barrett," Dr. Thompson tried again, keeping his voice professional and calm, just as he did during hospital emergencies. "I understand you're doing your job, but you're making a mistake. Just call the hospital." "Stop talking," Barrett cut him off sharply. "You expect me to believe you're really the chief of emergency medicine? Do you know how many fake IDs we see every week?" 2 more police cars pulled up, their lights painting the street in flashing red and blue. Dr. Thompson could see curious faces in the windows of nearby houses, watching the scene unfold. He thought about how this would look in tomorrow's newspaper, a respected doctor handcuffed on the side of the road. "Search the vehicle," Barrett commanded one of the newly arrived officers. "Check for anything suspicious." Dr. Thompson watched helplessly as they went through his car. They pulled out his medical bag, his laptop, and even the half-eaten sandwich he'd forgotten to finish during his busy shift. His white doctor's coat fell to the ground, and nobody bothered to pick it up. "Sir," one young officer called out, holding up some papers from the glove compartment. "I got his car registration here. The vehicle belongs to a Dr. Marcus Thompson. Insurance and registration are all current." Barrett barely glanced at the papers. "Could be stolen. Run the plates." Dr. Thompson felt his patience starting to wear thin. "Officer Barrett, I was on duty when you were brought into the ER 3 months ago after your accident. I treated you. Your wife visited every day. You were in room 412. What more proof do you need?" Something flickered across Barrett's face. Uncertainty, perhaps, but it quickly hardened again. Anyone could have gotten that information. For all I know, you could have stolen a real doctor's identity. Just then, another police car arrived. As its door opened, Dr. Thompson recognized Officer Mike Chen stepping out. Chen had been Barrett's partner during the accident and had visited him regularly in the hospital. "Jimmy, what's going on here?" Chen called out as he approached. Then he stopped suddenly, his eyes widening as he recognized Dr. Thompson. "Wait a minute. Dr. Thompson? What are you doing here?" Barrett turned to his partner, confused. "You know this guy?" "Know him?" Chen looked shocked. "Jimmy, this is Dr. Thompson, the surgeon who saved your life. He's the one who operated on you in the ER when you were brought in after the crash. He's the reason you're alive right now." The flashlight in Barrett's hand wavered, then dropped slightly. "What are you talking about?" "He performed emergency surgery right there in the trauma bay," Chen explained, his voice growing more frustrated. "Your heart was failing, you were bleeding internally. Dr. Thompson worked on you for over 2 hours. The whole department knows about it. It was incredible. The night seemed to grow very quiet. Even the distant traffic sounds felt muted." Barrett's face had lost its confident expression, replaced by something that looked like confusion, then shock, and finally, horrifying realization. Dr. Thompson stood quietly, still handcuffed, as he watched the truth sink in. He could have been angry, could have threatened lawsuits or complained about racial profiling. Instead, he just waited, thinking about how this moment might change both their lives. I didn't know," Barrett finally stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. He quickly moved to unlock the handcuffs, his hands shaking slightly. "Dr. Thompson, It's okay, Officer Barrett," Dr. Thompson said softly as he rubbed his wrists. "But maybe now we need to have a conversation about assumptions and what they can cost us." The other officers stood awkwardly around them, witnesses to a moment none of them would soon forget. And somewhere in the distance, a new siren wailed. The night shift at Metropolitan General Hospital continued, where lives were saved without asking who deserved saving. The next morning, news of the incident spread through both the hospital and police department like wildfire. Dr. Marcus Thompson sat in his office at Metropolitan General, staring at the pile of messages on his desk. Local news reporters had been calling since dawn, eager to tell the story of the doctor who was handcuffed by the very officer whose life he had saved. His phone buzzed again, another reporter. Dr. Thompson ignored it, just as he had ignored all the others. Instead, he focused on the incident report he was writing. His hands moved slowly across the keyboard, carefully choosing each word. He wanted the report to be factual, not emotional. A soft knock on his office door made him look up. Sarah, the nurse who had assisted him during Officer Barrett's surgery, stood in the doorway with a concerned look on her face. "Dr. Thompson," she said quietly, "Officer Barrett is in the lobby. He's asking to speak with you." Thompson leaned back in his chair, remembering the events of last night, the flashing lights, the cold handcuffs, the look of shock on Barrett's face when he finally realized the truth. "Send him up," he said after a moment's thought. 5 minutes later, Officer James Barrett stood in Thompson's office doorway. He was in civilian clothes today, not his uniform, and his face showed he hadn't slept much. The confident police officer from last night was gone, replaced by a man who looked uncomfortable in his own skin. "Please, sit down," Dr. Thompson gestured to a chair, keeping his voice professional. Barrett sat down slowly, his eyes taking in the office, the medical degrees on the wall, the family photos on the desk, the surgical textbooks on the shelves. All the evidence of a life dedicated to saving others. "Dr. Thompson," Barrett began, then stopped, struggling with his words. "I don't even know how to start." "Start with why you really pulled me over," Thompson said quietly. Barrett's face flushed red. "I saw an expensive car driving late at night. When I saw the driver was..." He paused, embarrassed. "When you saw the driver was black," Thompson finished for him. "Yes," Barrett admitted, looking down at his hands. "I assumed. I made assumptions I shouldn't have made. Then when I saw the hospital ID, I couldn't believe someone I thought it had to be fake." Dr. Thompson stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the hospital parking lot below. "The same hands you didn't trust with an ID card were the hands that held your heart 3 months ago," he said thoughtfully. Barrett's eyes filled with tears. "The Internal Affairs Department wants to meet with me this afternoon. There's going to be an investigation." "Good," Thompson replied, turning back to face him. "There should be. But that's not why you came here, is it?" "No," Barrett admitted. "I came because I needed to face you, to apologize, to try to understand how I could be so wrong, so blind. Dr. Thompson sat down again, studying the man in front of him. Officer Barrett, do you know why I never introduced myself during your recovery? Why I checked on you every day, but always from a distance? Barrett shook his head. Because I've learned that sometimes it's easier for people if they don't have to reconcile their prejudices with reality, if they can just receive care without having to think about who's providing it. That's horrible, Barrett whispered. Yes, it is, Thompson agreed. But last night proved why I've learned to be careful. The same person can save your life one day and be treated like a criminal the next, simply because of how they look. A long silence filled the office. Outside, the usual sounds of hospital life continued. Phones ringing, people talking, elevator doors opening and closing. Finally, Barrett spoke again. What can I do? He asked simply. How do I make this right? Dr. Thompson looked at the man whose life he had saved, whose prejudices had led to last night's confrontation, and whose genuine remorse now filled his office. That depends, he said carefully, on how much you're willing to learn from this experience. The conversation that followed would change both their lives forever, but in ways neither of them could yet imagine. 1 week after the incident, the Atlanta Police Department's main conference room was packed with officers, city officials, and news reporters. Chief Williams, the head of the police department, stood at the podium, his face serious as camera flashes lit up the room. After a thorough investigation of last week's incident, Chief Williams announced, "We have decided to implement immediate changes in our department's training programs. Officer Barrett has been suspended for 2 weeks and will be required to complete additional training before returning to active duty." In the back of the room, Dr. Marcus Thompson stood quietly, watching the proceedings. He hadn't planned to attend the press conference, but the hospital board had insisted he be present. Next to him, his wife Sarah squeezed his hand supportively. News cameras turned to focus on Officer Barrett as he stepped up to the podium. He looked different from the confident officer who had pulled Dr. Thompson over that night. His voice shook slightly as he began to speak. "Last week, I made a terrible mistake," Barrett said, his eyes scanning the crowd until they found Dr. Thompson. "I let my prejudices cloud my judgment. I handcuffed and humiliated the very man who saved my life 3 months ago." Reporters' hands shot up, but Barrett continued speaking. "Dr. Thompson could have pressed charges. He could have demanded my badge. Instead, he showed me the same compassion he showed when he saved my life. A compassion I failed to return." At the hospital across town, nurses and doctors gathered around TV screens in the break room, watching their colleague become the center of a story that was now making national headlines. Sarah, the night nurse who had assisted in Barrett's surgery, wiped tears from her eyes as she watched. The story had sparked intense discussions about racial profiling in law enforcement. Local community leaders were calling for changes in police training. But for Dr. Thompson, standing in that conference room, it wasn't about making headlines or forcing policy changes. It was about something more personal. After the press conference, Dr. Thompson found himself in a small meeting room with Officer Barrett and several police department officials. They were discussing plans for a new training program, one where Dr. Thompson would share his story with new police recruits. "We think your perspective could help our officers understand the impact of their assumptions," explained the training coordinator. "Would you be willing to speak to our cadets?" Dr. Thompson looked at Barrett, who had been unusually quiet during the meeting. "Only if Officer Barrett agrees to share his side of the story too," he replied. "This isn't about blame. It's about learning and changing." Barrett looked up, surprised. "You want me to be part of this? After what I did?" "Your honest account of that night, and what you learned from it, might prevent other officers from making the same mistake," Dr. Thompson explained. "Sometimes the best teachers are those who have learned the hardest lessons." The local newspaper ran a photo the next day showing Dr. Thompson and Officer Barrett shaking hands after the meeting. The headline read, "From confrontation to collaboration, Doctor and Officer unite to create change." Back at Metropolitan General, Dr. Thompson returned to his regular duties, but things felt different now. Other doctors and nurses looked at him with new respect. Patients sometimes recognized him from the news stories. Even some of his colleagues began sharing their own experiences with racial profiling. Late one evening, as Dr. Thompson finished his shift, he passed the emergency room trauma bay where he had saved Barrett's life months ago. He paused, remembering that night, the urgency, the focus, the pure mission of saving a life without knowing anything about the person on the table. His phone buzzed with a text message from Barrett. First training session scheduled for next month. Thank you for giving me a chance to make this right. Dr. Thompson smiled slightly as he typed his reply. Sometimes the best healing happens outside the operating room. As he walked to his car that night, no police cars followed him, but he knew the real change wouldn't come from one incident or one story. It would come from the difficult conversations that were just beginning, from the willingness to learn from mistakes, and from the courage to face uncomfortable truths. 6 months had passed since that fateful night of the traffic stop. The large auditorium at the Atlanta Police Academy was filled with young police cadets, their blue uniforms crisp and new. It was graduation day for the latest class, but this ceremony was different from previous years. Dr. Marcus Thompson stood at the podium, his white doctor's coat a stark contrast against the sea of blue uniforms. Next to him stood Officer James Barrett, now back on active duty after completing his training and suspension. The two men had become an unlikely but powerful team. When I became a doctor, Dr. Thompson began, addressing the eager faces before him, I took an oath to treat all patients equally, regardless of who they are. That night 3 months ago, I was just leaving the hospital after saving 3 lives during my shift. One was a homeless man, another was a wealthy businessman, and the third was a child. I didn't see their color, their status, or their background. I just saw people who needed help. The room was completely silent. In the front row, Chief Williams nodded encouragingly. This was the 10th time Dr. Thompson and Officer Barrett had shared their story, but it felt just as important as the first. Barrett stepped forward to take his turn. And when I became a police officer, I took an oath to protect and serve everyone equally. But that night, I forgot that oath. I saw Dr. Thompson's expensive car and his skin color, and I made assumptions that could have destroyed both our lives. Several cadets shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing their own potential to make similar mistakes. In the back of the room, Sarah, the night nurse who had witnessed both the surgery and the aftermath, watched proudly. She had become a regular supporter at these sessions. Today, Dr. Thompson continued, Officer Barrett and I don't just tell our story. We show what can happen when people face their mistakes and commit to real change. Since we started this program, complaints of racial profiling in our district have dropped by 40%. Barrett stepped forward again, but numbers don't tell the whole story. Last week, I responded to a car accident. The driver was a young black doctor heading home from his shift. 6 months ago, I might have treated him with suspicion. Instead, I remembered Dr. Thompson. I remembered the lesson I learned, and I treated that young doctor with the respect he deserved. After the ceremony, Dr. Thompson and Officer Barrett walked together through the police academy parking lot. Their cars were parked next to each other, the blue BMW and the police cruiser, a sight that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. My daughter starts medical school next fall, Barrett said suddenly. Last night, she told me she chose emergency medicine because of your story, because of how you handled everything. Dr. Thompson smiled. And my son just entered the police academy. He says he wants to be the kind of officer you become. They stopped at their cars, both thinking about how much had changed. The incident that could have ended in tragedy had instead sparked a movement. Other police departments across the country had started requesting their training program. News shows had interviewed them about their story of redemption and change. You know, Barrett said thoughtfully, sometimes I think about that night in the ER, when you saved my life. You didn't know then that I would be the same officer who would profile you and put you in handcuffs. And you didn't know I would be the same doctor who would help you become a better officer, Dr. Thompson replied. As they prepared to leave, a young cadet approached them nervously. Dr. Thompson, Officer Barrett, she said, I just wanted to thank you. Your story helped me understand something I didn't even know I needed to learn. They watched her walk away, knowing their work was making a difference, one person at a time. The sun was setting over Atlanta, casting long shadows across the parking lot. In the distance, sirens wailed. Perhaps another emergency room doctor rushing to save another life. Perhaps another police officer responding to a call. But tonight, in this parking lot, a doctor and a police officer, one black, one white. shook hands, and parted ways, knowing that sometimes the greatest healings happen not in hospitals or police stations, but in the moments when people choose to learn from their mistakes and work together for change.